This is, I'm Clarissa Clò. I'm a professor and chair in the Department of European Studies. I'm also the professor in this class. At this time of the day, we teach Italian American Studies here. So this is what we're doing today. We're very lucky to have my colleague and friend, Teresa Fiore, Dr. Teresa Fiore. She's coming to us from Montclair State University. She is the INSERA chair, endowed chair in Italian and Italian American Studies at Montclair State. She just published this book, which is going to be absolutely influential in Italian studies, called Preoccupied Spaces.
She's a friend.
Yes, that too. There's nothing wrong with that. This presentation is within a series also of events that have been put together by the Department of European Studies along with the Department of English and Comparative Literature and MALAS, and are part of the common experience. The theme for this year's experience was imagination. So we've named my colleagues, in particular Christine Ribin in German and Emily Schuckman-Matthews in European Studies, have named this series Imagining Europe. And I think there's quite a bit to reimagine and reimagine about Europe. So this is particularly timely. And we are friends because we did go to grad school together. We met at UCSD, actually. We met in San Diego quite a few years back. So we go, I won't say exactly when, what decade it was and all that. That's like too much information. After the presentation, I'm going to say the title in a minute, we do have a respondent, another distinguished guest, Dr. Norma Bouchard, who's the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters here at San Diego State. Also very well known in the field of Italian studies, has published extensively from Umberto Eco to modernism, postmodernism, critical theory, Italian American studies, and also what we're going to address today, Italian and Mediterranean studies. With no further ado, I will leave you to Teresa Fiore's presentation, which is entitled Preoccupied Spaces, Remapping Italian Transnational Migrations and Culture in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Yes?
Thank you. But I think I need you here for
yes.
a second.
Yes.
Okay. Non si vede la...
You can also applaud.
Sorry about this.
We are Italian and we love drama.
So, well, thank you, grazie to all of you for being here. It's a particularly special moment. It's not just presenting my book, but presenting it at a place that has a special meaning to me. In 1995, I landed here from Italy, and it was my first experience as an immigrant myself to this country, and this is where I started my graduate studies. And there are some people in this room, such as Edith Benkov, who actually welcomed me back then as a student in the English and Comparative Literature department, and then I became a TA in Italian. And so I'm technically an alumna, and that's a great pleasure. There are also some people in the audience here who welcome me in many other ways, people who used to work at the International Center and who've become family. And the family has been growing, not only with Clarissa as a special colleague and friend, but definitely Norma Bouchard as a very well-respected person in the field who's now your dean, and a very committed one from what I hear. And I've met new people in the course of coming here, and thank you for being here, Loredana, and thank you to the European Studies Department for bringing me here to reimagine Italy and Europe as a result together. But I want to say, by way of introduction that I hope that what I'm going to be telling you about is not a specific study about a specific country, but really a case study that can allow us to think in many different directions, hopefully about the past, but also the present and even our own present. Let's not forget that we're on the border between US and Mexico, a very particularly intense, strong, controversial and debated one, which is at the center of the debate on immigration, which today is at the center of many, many things for modern nations, supranations, and for international relations. So, what I was thinking about doing with you was to start with the title of my book and walk you through the various parts of the title and the subtitles. But I'll do it in a reverse way, in the sense that preoccupied spaces is what I want to get to last, because I want for you to have a context around what I've been doing, not only with this book, but what has been really at the heart of my research for a very long time, coming out of the Department of Literature UCSD, and on a topic, immigration, that is personal in many ways, but of course has become much more than that. Remapping Italy is one of the key terms for today's presentation, transnational migrations and colonial legacies. In a nutshell, I'm interested in showing you how people have left Italy in very large numbers for a very long period of time. Now, many people are going to Italy. Interestingly, many continue to leave Italy. And in the background of this large, complex history of mobility, we also have colonialism, which is not as central to the discourse sometimes about Italy outside of Italian studies. It's been a very important topic, but generally speaking, and I'd like to hear from the class, as a matter of fact, how much you think of colonialism when you think about emigration and immigration. The fundamental premise of the book, and hence of the talk today, is that the contemporary history of Italian civilization cannot be understood without a rigorous reconsideration of the influence of its outbound and inbound migrations, including, as I just said, the colonial experience of the country. And what I want to stress is that these are not marginal aspects of the country's history, but I claim that they're actually central, congenital to the formation of the country as a nation, including its complicated both birth and development over time. And I maintain that the reason why to this day many issues are still so complicated, it's because this history has not been addressed in depth and with all its implications. As a result, I think that actually Italy is a very fascinating laboratory for rethinking categories of belonging. Because of this mobility, because of this large immigration, because of colonialism, because of what I call indirect colonialism, and I'll get to that term in a moment, and of course because of immigration. So in other words, the question that I ask is, what does it mean to be Italian in a culture defined by boundary crossing, movements, displacements, and differences, especially for a country that is very young. We often think of Italy as a very old one, but actually as a unified country is much younger than this country, right? And so this has been a central question for me, and I'm sure it's been a central question even in the Italian-American class, right, that you are, many of you are part of. So let's start with the emigration, and let's look at some maps. Remapping Italy is indeed this endeavor on my part to really think about space and geography as a central parameter to understand the issue at hand. Italians have emigrated in very large numbers. 26 to 27 million people have left the country between 1876 and 1976. Historians and statisticians calculate that 50% of them have actually returned. Regardless, it's a huge diaspora. It's a dispersion of really large size. And interestingly, I don't know how many of you can see here on the bottom, many of them came to the United States. That's why the Italian emigrant is very often associated with the idea of being an Italian, in particularly in New York, for example. We're talking about more than 5 million people. But I think it's interesting to point out the fact that emigration was also a European phenomenon, and this is because of geographical proximity, because it was easy to go back and forth, obviously. So France, Switzerland, although interestingly we never think of an Italian French or an Italian Swiss, and then Argentina, another major destination, especially at the beginning of this large diaspora. Continuing on, Germany, Brazil, and Canada. It is of no surprise then that Italy's diaspora has been considered actually the largest emigration from any country, by which I think Rudolf Ecoli, the historian, meant of any modern country. And also keep in mind that Italy was formed in 1861, so we're talking about a diaspora that happens practically 15 years after its formation. So the country becomes one, and immediately it loses its own population. What is the result of this emigration? A very large population of descendants. Some of the latest calculations talk about 60 to 80 million, but these are pretty old calculations. As you can see, 1994. The work of Piero Bassetti, who's a non-academic who really believes in the concept of Italici. Italics is calculating 250,000 people around the world, combining both descendants, Italians were constantly moving, and Italophiles. But let's look at this map, and maybe we can think about it together a little bit so we can make this somewhat interactive. So remember, we had more than 5 million people going to the United States. Where is the largest number of Italian descendants today? And why do you think so? It was also a very important country of destination, so it makes sense that the Italian population is large there. But why do you think that Brazil, for that matter, Argentina as well, still have so many Italians?
Larger population growth in those countries?
Yes, to which Italians participated. They had a lot of children. They had a lot of children because they needed to till the land. They were given land, but they needed 14 children to make it happen. So that impacted exactly the demographic weight in these countries. Why more in Brazil than France, for example, you think? Especially over time. If you go to France, you can easily go back. Exactly. In Argentina and Brazil, you have to rethink yourself, right? So why am I asking you these questions? Because I would like for you to, leave this conversation with the idea that Italy is in Argentina. Even though it cannot be, further away, right, from Italy. And it's exactly this geographical reversal and geographical displacement that I want for us to keep in mind as we continue to explore this subject. When we look at the map of colonialism, which you may have touched upon this subject. I know that Professor Clough is very interested in this subject, especially because of its post-colonial ramifications. We're talking about an empire that formed very late compared to other major European countries, that did not last long, and that was quite dispersed, as you can see, because we're talking about the Horn of Africa, a Mediterranean country, another Mediterranean country technically in Eastern Europe, and also a territory in China. By the end of World War II, a few years after that, basically this empire was dissolved. And the interesting part here is that even though not too many Italians moved to these territories, we're talking about 2% of the Italian population, still is something that we need to keep in mind, because this happened at the same time of emigration. So in this respect, the concept that Mark Choate has offered to us, emigrant colonialism, is very interesting to keep in mind, because colonies in Italy were both the territories that were conquered in other continents, but were also the communities of Italians abroad. And this will come up again when we talk about the current citizenship law and the paradoxes that it's creating when it comes to, let's say, Africans who now live in Italy. And the final map is the one about immigration in Italy. Now, if you remember, I told you that officially in 1976, emigration stops, right? So from that point on, Italy becomes, within a matter of years, literally, a country of destination. And unlike many other countries, such as France, for example, or the UK, it's not a destination for post-colonial subjects. That is to say, these people are not coming from Libya. Yes, they are coming from Ethiopia and Eritrea, but not in large numbers. And this is where the concept of indirect post-colonialism comes into play, in the sense that these people have been basically under other types of colonial regimes, and in many cases also communist regimes. As you can see, the largest communities include Romanians, Moroccans, Albanians, Chinese, which again, interestingly, creates new geographies that are quite unexpected, right? Because there is no immediate connection. And this is what I just shared with you, this concept of indirect colonialism, which maybe we can get into this during the Q&A, but it interestingly liberates many of these subjects because they're not interacting with a country with which there is a relationship of subjugation, including in terms of language. Now, in the remapping, we should also include the fact that Italy is now emigrating again. So even though in 1976 officially the phenomenon was over, as of 2012 actually the migratory net has been negative again. It means that there are more people leaving the country than actually entering the country. And this phenomenon has been growing very fast. We're talking about 125,000 people who left only in 2016. And this is mostly the result of, why are so many Italians leaving? I understand that maybe there's even somebody in this class who has left Italy quite recently. Why are Italians leaving, especially very young ones? Yes?
There's no jobs, the unstable government.
Absolutely. What I call the stable instability of Italy in terms of economic and political situation made particularly severe, I think, in these very days. And attached to that, the whole idea of lack of meritocracy, right? And other new factors that have come into play, cheap transportation, right? And fast communication, so that, you know, this mobility basically is made much easier. What you were just saying is perfectly exemplified in this vignette, in which a young person says, "Ciao, mamma, I'm off to go job hunting," and the mother reminds the daughter or son, depending on how you look at it, don't forget to take your passport. By now, the idea is that if you want some kind of life project, you have to go someplace else. Now, in the face of this incredibly large and complex, map of Italian mobility, the myth of invasion in these days, which, as you know, has been going on for quite a while, seems to be particularly unsustainable, right? Not only because Italians have been going everywhere, so why is it that we don't perceive ourselves as invaders of other places, but other people seem to invade Italy totally improperly. There's also the issue of the low fertility rate, which continues to go down, even though we were already one of the few so-called advanced democracies registering this low fertility rate. And as you know, a really high percentage of elderly people who increasingly need all kinds of services and supports that are often coming from immigrants. And the other one is the manufacturing of the sense of emergency, right? The idea that we are now invaded, when in reality this has been happening for a very long time. People have been coming for decades, and the idea of representing such a structural phenomenon with all these implications and this impact on the society seems to be definitely a misnomer, and it would require definitely a different type of approach on the part of the government. So let me now get to the title. How is it that I have approached this topic? Fundamentally, I've been reading for many, many years texts, which I call in this book cultural texts, that is to say memoirs, novels, songs, where the experience of migration, as I call it, so that I can bring together emigration and immigration when I talk about mobility, really contains a very interesting reverberations and commonalities over time. I'm not trying to bring these experiences together in an easy and reductive way, but fundamentally there are many commonalities, right? The idea of being uprooted, of having to, travel, of having to look for a job, of finding a place to live, or finding a new identity. And these commonalities took me to the conclusion that indeed, if we start looking at how much the experience of immigration today is occupied by the experience of emigration in the past, which I suggest with the term preoccupied, we can actually completely reverse the kind of rhetorics that we're hearing in these days in the media, among politicians, and as you can imagine, this trickles through, right, in the general perception. And eventually, I maintain that a familiarity and a deeper knowledge of the experience of emigration in the past can actually diffuse the preoccupation without the hyphen that has been fostered, right, around the phenomenon. So it's fundamentally a historical awareness that can allow us to hopefully have a different approach to this subject. Why with space? Because even though very often, and I did it as well, we think about migration in terms of time. When did it start? When did it end? It's really a question of space. And historically, indeed, this has been done. But the shift towards space has been really prompted by my desire, as I suggested today, earlier on, to rethink this position of Italy on the global map, so that Albania and Argentina are not separate from the country, but are profoundly related to it. And it's possible to find Italy in these places, both historically and in the present, as much as it is possible to find these places today in Italy. The question where is my desire to place a different issue at the core of our discussion. In this sense, I embrace Michel Foucault's proposal that the present epoch will perhaps be above all the epoch of space. His belief that the anxiety of our era has to do fundamentally with space, much more than with time, I think is proving very true. We're not dealing with with trajectories that are related to time. We're dealing with borders, we're dealing with walls, we're dealing with territorial belonging and territorial sovereignty fundamentally. That's why in the book I adopt many different notions, theoretical notions, such as heterotopia by Foucault, third space by Soja, dissemination by Baba, imagination by Cassano, and we have here Norma Bouchard, who's worked a lot on Cassano, or Spivak's imagining planetarity. I don't have the time to go into the different ways in which I have used these terms in the different parts of the book, but they have really become the structure, the infrastructure of the book. And you can ask me more about the use of this theory. Before I move to the specific example of one section of the book, I wanted to address some interesting numerical coincidences that I think are also very useful to dissipate the fear of invasion that I was referring to earlier on. We're dealing, as already mentioned, with a country that has the same number of residents today and descendants around the world, if not even more, right? So we have technically more Italians, however you want to define them, outside of the country than in the country. When you look at the numbers of immigrants in Italy today, we have 5 million plus official. Without this does not include the so-called undocumented. Interestingly, the records of Italians residing abroad, the AIRE, show the same number. 5 million plus. It's a complicated number that needs a little bit of breakdown, because it includes, oddly enough, both people who have moved to the United States fairly recently, but also Italian Americans, Italian, French, so Italian descendants who have decided to reacquire Italian citizenship because Italy allows for dual citizenship. Interesting merging, though, interesting blending also from a conceptual point of view, right? And finally, a number that, of course, you have to take with, the necessary, with the benefit of the doubt, is that 500,000 people are undocumented in Italy today. This is a bit of an outdated, though, calculation. And around the same year, the same number of Italians without documents were registered around the world. Most of them basically go abroad because they don't need a visa, so very easily as tourists, and they overstay trying to create a new opportunity abroad for themselves. So let's just keep those coincidences in mind. Now, I'm not suggesting that numbers are absolutely essential to address this issue. I'm actually interested in how stories tell much more than numbers. And we are bombarded by numbers when we talk about immigration most of the time. But they're both very useful. The same way it's useful to combine social sciences and humanities in talking about what ultimately we can consider un fatto sociale totale, a total social fact. Immigration allows us to talk about society in the most comprehensive way, right? Whether it's economics, whether it's religion, and so on and so forth. And of course, as a result, we need to do it in an interdisciplinary way. And my book really tried to do that, even though obviously its focus remained primarily on cultural texts after I introduced the socioeconomic contexts around them. And I tried to really look at a very wide variety of texts, both visual and audio, in order to provide a sense of the diversity and the variety. The book is divided in 3 parts. The first one is called Waters and deals with the journey, especially across oceans and seas. It is the one that I will be talking about to you in a moment. The second one is called Houses. I'm interested in looking at the places where immigrants live. in this case both Italians who moved to, let's say, Argentina, or Romanians living in Italy today. And finally, workplaces. As much as I try to move away from the association between immigration and labor only, obviously it remains an absolutely essential topic to address. So let me get to Waters for a moment and ask you, what is it that you have read about immigration to Italy in the past couple of years or so? Major newspapers, social media?
Maybe past couple of months.
Well, in terms of how it's been represented in the...
Into Italy via the ocean.
Absolutely.
What kind of image do you think we have received?
Unpleasant, that people are trying to escape dire poverty and to immigrate into a country that's more prosperous.
Okay, so the idea that there's desperation and they're moving towards a new possibility. Any other comment? Visually, what is it that we get to see?
Try to go again.
Exactly, a boat loaded with people, right? So pretty much, this image, constantly bombarded, right? With this image, there is no story about the point of departure, and practically no story about the point of arrival, right? So it's a snapshot of a moment that is incredibly mobile, but for some reason it's strongly frozen. So around that idea, I've been asking, what else can we tell about, something that is flattened so easily, especially by the media? We're numbed by numbers. What are the stories that cultural texts are telling us? To give you a quick example of how I've been interested in seeing how cultural texts are bringing together emigration and immigration, I thought about sharing this video of it's a song that was created based on the poetic verses of Henry De Luca. It was adapted by the Canzoniere Grecanico Salentino, a prominent group that has, among many, reintroduced the Taranta. And it is directed by Alessandro Gasman. And it's technically not part of the book, but I thought that for your class, it would actually work very well. And works very well.
$5.
Should we turn the lights?
Sure. One way, solo andata.
Siamo lì innumerevoli, raddoppia ogni casella di scacchiera, lastrichiamo di corpi il vostro mare per camminarci sopra.
Non potete contarci, se contati aumentiamo, figli dell'orizzonte che ci rovescia a sacco.
Nessuna polizia può farci prepotenza più di quanto già siamo stati offesi. Faremo i servi, figli che non fate, le nostre vite, i nostri libri di avventura. Portiamo vero e Dante, il cieco e il pellegrino, l'odore che perdeste, l'uguaglianza che avete sottomesso. reggiamo il peso, spaliamo neve, pettiniamo prati.
Battiamo tappeti, raccogliamo il pomodoro e l'insulto. Noi siamo i piedi e conosciamo il suono passo a passo.
Noi siamo il rosso e il nero della terra, un oltremare di sandali sfondati, il polline e la polvere nel vento di stasera. Uno di noi al nome di tutti ha detto non vi sbarazzerete di me. Va bene, muoio ma in 3 giorni resuscito e ritorno.
In braccio al Mediterraneo, migratori di Africa e di Oriente affondano nel cavo delle onde. Il pacco dei semi portati da casa si sparge tra le alghe e i capelli. La terraferma Italia è terra chiusa. Li lasciamo annegare per negare.
I'm not going to comment specifically about the tone and register and perspective of this video, but I thought it would be a good example of that connection that I'm suggesting, and also of the idea of empathy that I'm here basically introducing, the idea that it is by reading the past into the present that we can start thinking through different paradigms. Annegare and negare is what Henri De Luca, whom you see actually at the very end of the video, this is the poet, is the play on word that is suggesting to drown and to deny, where there is obviously a very strong ethical responsibility that is pointing to. So let me quickly walk you through one section of the book so you have a sense of how I've tried to offer this idea of preoccupation in linking, interconnecting texts about the past or of the past with texts of the present. Here you can see the variety of cultural texts that I've chosen. Some of them you may be familiar with. Have they seen Golden Door in this class? Here we're talking about immigration from Italy to the US. Here immigration from Northern Africa to Italy, from Africa through Libya to Italy. Here we're talking actually about Italians in the US, a result of mixed couples between Italians and African Americans, so Italians with a black skin. So I was interested in showing this variety. By putting together, for example, a historical account by journalist Gian Antonio Stella called The Horde When We Were the Albanians, a pretty interesting and also controversial subtitles over the years, published in 2003, and a film by Emanuele Crialese by 2006 called Golden Door. In Italian, it was called Nuovo Mondo, which is actually a much more interesting title than Golden Door. And this is where I suggest the unlikely connections between emigration and immigration, because clearly Gian Antonio Stella wanted to talk about immigration abroad, to point our attention to current immigration back then in Italy, and clearly the fact that allegedly, or presumably the first movie about Italian immigration in 2006, the first movie that really comprehensively talks about the journey from Italy to the United States, comes out at a time when there is obviously a very heated debate about immigration in Italy. And the echoes between immigration and emigration are very clear here, even in some of the visual solutions that Emanuele Crialese actually adopts, adapting the famous stills from the ships that were taking Italians and also many others to the United States, with contemporary images of foreigners coming over. My point here is that we have also crossed many oceans and seas. We've also done it in an undocumented way, which is often forgotten. You probably talked about the term WAP, Clarissa, in this class. Do you remember what it stands for?
Without papers.
Without papers, or without official papers. Now that when we say WAP, we're still thinking about an Italian is a question that I want to leave you with, right? And yet all of a sudden here we are talking about undocumented immigrants in Italy as a problem. What I want to stress though is that they've also been able to come through legal routes, which is something that is currently being denied to immigrants in Italy and in Europe, which is one of the reasons why this is a problem rather than a phenomenon with possibilities, both for the countries of departure and the countries of arrival. The other three texts that I connect are the songs by Mignonette, the first half of the 20th century, the queen of emigrants, somebody who really embodied the sense of nostalgia for emigrants who were thinking about Naples, for example, as the embodiment of the roots. Of course, it was a sublimation of their experience. And I connected to stories, as I said before, of immigration and emigration. What I detect there is, again, the idea in particular with the last book, let me go back to it for a moment, The Skin Between Us by Kim Ragusa, called subtitled A Memoir of Race, Beauty, and Belonging. The idea that there are even more interconnections and subtexts here. The fact that when we talk about Italian African Americans in the Bronx, right, there are actually stories of colonialism and slavery that we need to unpack there, and not only with Italy as a form of colonial power, but obviously with ships that, as a matter of fact, were slavery ships originally, and in some cases became ships for immigrants. And today, obviously, the treatment of migrants, especially in the so-called third countries, in terms of this extra external borderization of the European Union, where we are basically shifting the responsibility to other countries outside of Europe. We know very well that the treatment has really gotten to the level of slavery, where people are being sold before leaving. And the last one is this very interesting film called Tornando a Casa, Sailing Home, the fascinating story of a young Neapolitan whose dream is that of going to the United States. Again, the idea is that you make it somewhere else. He's working as a fisherman on a boat along with a Tunisian immigrant who instead is trying to make it in Italy. So we see these parallel dreams and opportunities that are being sought. And eventually he actually bumps into a boat of undocumented immigrants coming to Italy, and he chooses to join them, but he'll be rejected and sent back to Tunisia instead, in part because he looks like one. So the other interesting implications here are that of not being that different very often from the very people that are considered to be others. The artificial wall that is being established in the Mediterranean then needs to be, if anything, rethought and reread through the history of connections among Mediterranean countries that have been in place for many, many centuries. And so all of these, I hope, and I'm here concluding, allows us to go beyond a fossilized representation or perception of immigration symbolized by the old boat loaded with people, and make us think differently about the Mediterranean, for example, which is a migrant space preoccupied by Italian stories of not too dissimilar experiences of voyages, dislocations, and also thinking of countries of origin and departure for current migrants as spaces that are preoccupied by Italian stories of not too dissimilar migration experiences. In other words, while adding Italians in the diaspora to its national records of citizens and voters, and I can tell you a little bit more about the voting law, the electoral law in Italy perhaps later, I think Italy should be preoccupied with defining a citizenship law that protects immigrants living in Italy today, extending its political asylum system in order to grant full protection, and mostly, which is something I just mentioned before, creating legal access routes for traveling migrants in order to dispel the preoccupation around the current invasion. That's what I think when I say imagination, that is to say a nation that is inclusive in terms of borders, and the moment it rethinks these borders in a creative way, it's actually setting up new possibilities. And that's what I meant when initially I said that Italy is a laboratory for rethinking categories of belonging, not only related to Italy, but I hope the conversation that will ensue will remind us of how it can be a point of departure to rethink immigration in many other places. And with that, I'm done, and I thank you very much for your attention.
So first of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation of a small portion of this book. This is a very, very important book, and what I would like to do is actually bring in the chronology, that is time. Of course, the focus of the book is on space. But time and space, of course, go together. And I'd like to do that very briefly because I think to have a sense of what happened in this very complex territory of Italy, I think it's really crucial in order to understand what it is that, that of course, Teresa has achieved. As I'm sure you know, you have picked up from her presentation, in Italy we've had a situation where multiple forms of colonialism, post-colonialism persist, interact, and imbricate with past and present day in migration and out migration. So Italy is an absolutely fascinating space precisely for this reason. So it's a very new country. was established in 1860, 1861, depending, maybe the 1870s, depending on how we solve the Roman question, right? But I do think important events took place from the 1860s onwards, and this is where all these different and complicated contexts of colonialism, post-colonialism, immigration play out. So I would say there are 4 really important moments that explain where we are now relative to the past and why this book is so significant. So in essence, I mean, this is a country that for some of us, and I'm one of them, I would argue that Italy was founded with an act of colonization. At certain point, the Savoy monarchy, this is in 1860, pretty much takes over southern Italy. The reason why it takes over southern Italy, it's pretty much the only one of the states in the peninsula at that point that has an army. It's also a monarchy that has embraced very early on a very capitalist ethos. So with what we call the unification, and unification is our founding moment, right? When Italy becomes a nation after being a constellation of little nation states and duchies and so forth. So this happens in 1860. There has been for several decades now a revisionist account of this Italy, but I think the documents that are coming out are pretty compelling. I do think that many of us think that yes, this was in fact a gesture, a colonial gesture. This monarchy, by the way, the monarchy spoke French, they didn't speak Italian, right? Subjugates the south of Italy and of course the island, and they are turned into exploitable colonies, and this happens around the 1860s. What happens to the south is pretty much turned into a supply base of natural resources and human labor, not dissimilar to what happened in other places. And that was very important in order to extract that value that would be very important to that accumulation that is at the origin of colonial endeavors. Very earlier on in this process, there is a 54% increase in direct taxes. Imagine that, 54%. And then a military conscription that lasts 5 years. So think about what happens when you are a population of, say, peasants and fishermen, where male labor is really, really important, right? The entire economy pretty much collapses. Another phenomenon that takes place that has been very well studied, around the 1860s, there is still a feudal land structure that takes place, that is in place in Italy. And it is a feudal land structure that allows tracts of land to the peasants and in order for foraging to take place or just subsistence farming. All of this land is actually enclosed and sold off. So, if you put things together, the huge tax increase and the fact that that safety valve that the feudal system allowed and the 5 year of military conscription, the economy completely collapsed. Of course, southern Italians don't just sit around and see this happen, right? So there are numerous uprisings, revolts, and the Savoy, the northern kingdom, deploys the army down in southern Italy. And in fact, they had more people down in southern Italy than all of the battles of unification combined. So the riots, the agitations, and at some point, you just cannot, you're overwhelmed. And it's when the big mass migration starts to take place. Between 1880 to 1915, we see 13 million people leaving. 2/3 of them actually come from the south. Yet another example of what unification meant. As Professor Fiore has illustrated, of course, the Americas are the primary destination, but a lot of individuals also leave for Northern and Central Europe. but also for non-Italian colonial holdings in Africa. So, for example, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. At some point, there were so many Italians in the French colonies that the French got really worried, right? But again, this was both a transatlantic and a Mediterranean migration. So really, we have a nation state that forms as a process of internal colonialism. So we have a post-colonial exodus right after unification. But what is very interesting is that at the same time that we have this post-colonial exodus, Italy also starts forging a colonial consciousness. In other words, it is at the end of the 19th century that Italy thinks that it can become a colonial power. Eastern African territories, and later on North Africa and the islands of the Dodecanese, and as well as Albania, are increasingly seen by the Italian states first as an opportunity for expansion, right? I mean, to be the same as the other big European nation, right? They're very late at the nation state phase, but also it's a way to show, you know, how this young nation can stand alongside Great Britain and France and so on. At the same time, it was also, you know, the fact that Italy was bleeding so many people was a sort of shame, right? So why not turn those peasants that are migrating all over North Africa into conquering warriors and imperialists, right? And here is where you have what Professor Fiore talked about, the concept of the colonia, which comes to mean during this time both the colonies abroad as well as the Italians as post-colonials who try to make a living you know, in the Americas, in North Africa, and so forth. So this is a phase, you know, that starts at the end of the 19th century, but really picks up during fascism. So, of course, Mussolini continues what had started in the government prior to his basically, you know, the declaration of the totalitarian state. You know, by 1922, parliament collapses, and this is where really Italian colonialism picks up. Becomes very, very aggressive, not that the one prior wasn't, but, you know, this is the time when we're seeing genocide, you know, bombings on civilian populations and so forth. By 1935, the colony of Libya is proclaimed, and in 1936, the empire of the Italian Empire of East Africa is established, and this is a huge, you know, huge territory. It merges Ethiopian Empire that was ruled, of course, by Haile Selassie with Eritrea and Somalia. Interesting enough, you know, the hopes that all the governments had harbored from the 19th century to fascism, that the colonies, the direct colonies of Italy would provide a solution, right, to the bleeding of this population, really don't work out. Italians do settle for a while in Libya and East Africa, but they're really outnumbered by the migration that takes place in many other areas of the world. So Italians continue to migrate, you know, in a number of other areas. Now, again, you know, it's, I'm not trying to advocate or argue for the exceptionality of the Italian colonialism. It was as brutal as all other colonialism, but it's very, very much complicated by specific contexts here. So one of those is, of course, Italy is on the wrong side of World War II. And with the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947, Italy basically enters the phase of post-colonialism, at least formally, because it is forced to abandon its colonies. So we didn't lose the colonies because of post-colonial state formation and wars of independence, like it happened, with the colonies of Great Britain or, for example, France. Italy loses the colonies because it loses the war. That's major. Why do you think it's so important? What do you think happened in Italy at this point? You lost the colonies because you lost the war.
Loss of revenue?
Well, not really, because oil actually was discovered much later. No. Yes?
Does it favor a connection between a sense of national identity and a desire for colonies?
So basically, I think the major effect that this had, it's like the loss of the colony, even though, there was a trustship that was retained and so forth, but the cultural consciousness, the national Italian cultural consciousness, really never comes to term with the colonial past. It didn't last very long, but it was as brutal as all other colonialism. But there wasn't the same process. Incidentally, of course, this is the same that happened under fascism, right? Italy never underwent the purges of Nazi Germany. There was an amnesty at the end of the war, so things just continued, right? But without really coming to term with this past. And that has had major, major consequences. It was also by design. So a lot of the colonial officers were still in control of all of the archives. It was really much, much later that this archive actually became available. We know of historians that tried to collect all kind of information, but they had to do it out of their own dime. And at least in one case, the person was even denied, a tenure position in one of the major Italian universities. So that process that, say, France underwent or other colonial powers really, did not take place in Italy. And there was also, all of this was also framed, I think, in a very interesting rhetoric. One was, Italian colonialism was a colonialism on the cheap, where poor people, pizza and mandolin, and da-da-da-da, and, somehow it's more benign.
And I have a question related to that. Whereas with Great Britain and the sun never sets on the British Empire,
Yes.
being a colonial power was very much a part of Great Britain and France's identity.
Yes.
Was colonialism a significant part of Italian identity during that era from 1870 until 1945?
So there were attempts, of course, but I don't think it ever reached, of course, those levels. Italy was very late, at the table. For example, the partition of Africa. Lasted very little, and it was always imbricated with this very complicated history of colonies as immigrant colonies, and of course settlement colonies. But again, because of what happened after World War II, basically an amnesty and just a burial of the past, right? I mean, the past is buried, we got to move on. There was never really a coming to terms. And incidentally, it has resurfaced, continues to resurface. So, for example, some of the atrocious crimes that were committed during this time, yes, people were tried, but not for the crimes that they committed. So, the national consciousness never really came to term with what happened. It's very interesting to see what happened in the 50s and 60s, for example, right? I mean, you have all kind of examples of Italian intellectuals, and I'm talking, major filmmakers and writers. They will produce films and works about the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese colonialism, but they never look at their own, right? I'm thinking about Pontecorvo, right? The Battle of Algiers, why aren't you looking at home, right? So it's a very interesting displacement, but many did so. And they had, all the possibilities and the chances of looking within, but they didn't. So it's a very interesting sort of blindness that takes place. Of course, this is protracted throughout the 50s and the 60s, And it's not that what I think it's perhaps, one of the laboratory, right, in the DNA of the Italian laboratory that take place doesn't end. So Italian migration continues. This is also the time, the 50s and 60s, of the incredible internal migration of Southerners to Northern Italy. It's the time that Italy modernizes. So we have the industrial triangle of Italy, Turin, Milan, and Genoa. It's where all the big automobile industries are set up. And so this is, a time of intra-peninsular migration, and you have 2 million Southerners who actually leave Southern Italy and move to the Northern Industrial Triangle. But they continue also to migrate, so North Europe, Canada, Latin America, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, at this time. This pattern just continue. Now, in the 1970s, really when there is a turning point, and this is the last sort of temporal connection I will make. So, up to this point, I would argue that there is really an occluded consciousness in Italy about, colonialism, migration, immigration, and so forth. But by the mid-70s, Italy starts becoming an immigrant destination. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Northern European states in 1974 put a limit on labor migrant, and so this basically redirect the flow of migration towards Southern Europe. Then we have the situation complicated by what's happening in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, with the faltering of communism. Then it's also a time where we have a lot of upheavals in former European colonies in the Middle East and Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, those are years when Italy, it's relatively prosperous. So it becomes, a destination for those, of course, who are less fortunate. And Italians start shunning low-wage jobs, and that creates a need, of course, for a labor migration. What's interesting, though, and here it's where, the importance, I think, of Teresa book comes out and what she's trying to achieve with this book. So as all these migratory movements start occurring on Italian soil, and I'm talking, within Italy, from Eastern Europe, so large migration from Albania, Romania, but also Ukraine, followed by Africa, individuals coming from Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Senegal, Asia, China, especially the Philippines and India. Italians start perceiving all of this as a threat, as an invasion. So it is as if that memory of the Italian as a migrant just isn't happening. But what is interesting at this time as well, and the ethnoscape of Italy literally changes. I don't know, many of you have been in Italy recently, and all of a sudden, you see the squares, the stores, the train stations, just being, it is a multicultural society, multi-ethnic society. So for Italians, it's really perceived as a threat. And I would say that perhaps this is the time when the strongest affirmation of an identity, which is in Italy has always been pretty loose, typically tied to the region of the city, takes place. But it is also at this time that a lot of these migrants actually start writing and start producing films and documentary and all kind of interesting music, artwork, visual artifacts and so forth. And I would argue also that, as there is this flourishing of what Teresa called the cultural texts, right, in preoccupied spaces, it is also when we're starting to think at migration, colonialism, and post-colonialism in very, very different ways. So post-colonial studies, which was something very novel in Italy, in fact, didn't really exist till the last 2 decades, really explode. undoubtedly, this is aided by the sort of institutionalization of post-colonial theory, right, that has taken place in the US and in other contexts. But clearly the rise of post-colonial studies in Italy, now has taken place, and it's growing by the day. It is impacting sociology, political theory, anthropology, history, film and cultural studies, and so on. So as a result, I think, of this turn, cultural texts from the past to the present are being assessed and reassessed in a reading of the particularities and specificity of this Italian colonial, imperial, emigrant, post-colonial, and immigrant context. And I think it's here that the significance of really Teresa's book lies. So before Teresa, we had the articles. You are taking a class in Italian-American culture, right? So I'm sure you are reading Fante, De Donato. Yeah? Yeah, who else?
Who else? Well, we saw The Godfather. Okay. Really foundational.
It is foundational. Yes, so prior to this book, we had, of course, individual treatments, right? So, scholars would study, for example, the culture and the literary work that come out of the Italian settlements in Egypt. Or, we had specialists of Italo-Canadian and Italian-American literature. So studies on De Donato, Fante, Mary Bucci Bush, Kim Ragusa, and so forth. And of course, in Italy and the US as well, a lot of studies on this emerging literature of, for lack of a better word, migrant post-colonial authors in Italy, the ones that are also writing stories, and they start writing from the 1980s onwards. But there was really nothing that brought them together. And all of those things are very much related. So Teresa has brought them all together in a space. So I would say that, it's a book that really deserves a special attention because it is the first book-length scholarly treatment of this nexus of immigration, direct and indirect coloniality, as well as post-coloniality. And not only it's a very well thought out book. She has developed a framework to bring together this, a range of cultural texts, and you have seen some of these cultural texts that speak to the complexity of Italy as a dissemination. So as a diasporic nation, a nation at large. You saw in the first slide, all the figures about the 60 million abroad, 60 million on the territory, and so on. In other words, it provides not just a cultural history of Italianness as understandable only from diasporic and transnational lenses, but offers the first comprehensive roadmap to read side by side cultural texts from 3 centuries, so from the 19th century, the unification, all the way to the 21st century, and across these 5 continents, so Africa, South America, North America, Europe, and Asia. So how did she do it, right? You saw just one piece, but it's a very sophisticated architecture. She brings together diasporic spaces. You saw the water, but also the tropes. So she's got the water, the journeys across the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, but also the one on the houses and the settlement. She has one on the work and the labor. And so by doing so, she enables a reading that really transcends the national boundaries of Italianness, right? And those are important because we tend to study Italy as a bounded nation. Think about the literary history, right, that exclude all of these authors, or think about the Italian national canon that excludes some more. The result, as she puts it in the conclusion, is, and I quote, a transnational vision in which dislocation allows us to make sense of a place, and in which diffusion carries a unique potential for fusion across boundaries. I really like this second piece. Diffusion carries a unique potential for fusion across boundaries. This potential for fusion is really a hermeneutic model. And it fosters in the readership, certainly this is what I experienced reading this book, a recognition by way of memory, but also by way of the imagination. It also builds ethical empathy in the readers and allows us to rethink what we think of the nation in a transnational dimension. I do have a couple of questions about the book. If I would like to know, or I would like to ask Teresa to elaborate some more on the ethical empathy through reading. And how the rich and imaginative cultural text that she examines through the architecture that she established can be translated into the current Italian political and social context. I know it's a big question, right? But we're here in a university, we have communities of readers. We are the ones that also write about and teach a certain work, right? So how can we translate what is happening in Italy, outside of Italy, in the university, in the classroom, against this political context that I'm sure, as you surmise or you read from the newspaper, if anything, is affirming more and more and more the nation. So how can we move, can we create more communities of meaning? And the other one is, what are the implications of this way or her architectural way of approaching the study and the teaching of Italian studies for the curriculum and for the research that we do. In other words, does it signal an opening to a different way of doing Italian studies today? Sure. Thank you.
She said she would have a few comments. Grazie, especially for a very busy dean. I am incredibly grateful, and I say this in particular with relation to your second question. The first one, I'm going to answer with an anecdote, and I hope that it'll shed some light on where you were trying to go with it. I teach classes such as this one. I teach classes about immigration in Italy. At some point, I addressed the issue of the citizenship law in Italy. How many of you are familiar with it? I can quickly give you an overview. But fundamentally, it's a blood-based jus sanguinis law, so that those who belong to the nation and are eligible for citizenship are those who have a family tie to Italy, which makes fundamentally an old Italian person living in San Francisco eligible to become an Italian, even though he may not speak Italian. He may not have been in Italy for a very long time, or maybe not even once. And that right is denied to the children of immigrants who were born in Italy or were taken to Italy when they were pretty young. They do become eligible to apply, but applying for it does not mean that they automatically get it. Now, when I tell this story, Norma, my students are very displaced. And some of them I teach in New Jersey, where there are a lot of vowels at the end of the last names of my students, are really surprised. Some of them have actually taken advantage of this law, and they have an Italian, which means a European passport. But they don't know what's behind it, because it's presented as a possibility, sometimes almost as a game, so this passport becomes a toy. None of them are currently thinking about moving to Italy for the reasons that you know, because jobs would not be available to them. But when they learn about the stories of the G2, right? When they listen to Amir Issa's rap songs, when they read novels and short stories, their perspective changes radically. And I will never remember a story that I tell in the I will forget the story that I tell in the conclusion of the book of Angelo, one of my students, who basically said, "I want to give my passport to one of these young people living in Italy who are children of Moroccans." So playfully, I've been thinking, what about launching a campaign where Italian descendants actually get their passports, but then they make them available through perhaps a lottery, right, to G2 or by now G3, people. So this is the kind of empathy that can be born out of knowledge, out of conversation, out of historical perspective, right? I strongly believe in it. It becomes an endeavor. It requires, of course, much commitment to reading, to understanding, to having conversations in an environment that, you're right, is less and less conducive to this, unfortunately, because we're actually given prepackaged ideas. They're circulated through tweeters, right, which is not by definition a space of conversation. And as a result, this has made our role, I think, as teachers, particularly important, and of you as students, who can actually have a very important voice in reversing the general approach to this topic. So that's what I mean by empathy, by cognition and recognition, by reactivation of memory. And the entire book is really built this way. I want for the readers to think about Italians living in Little Italy at the turn of the century in New York, and connecting them to Italians in Argentina, the former ones in tenements, the latter ones in conventillos in Buenos Aires, but then to think also of an occupied pasta factory, La Pantanella, outside of Rome in the 90s, as spaces that really were reproducing the same living conditions. These are unlikely connections, unexpected connections, but they need to be reactivated to get to the heart of the matter and diffuse, right, the fear, and create fusion instead. The second question is, I think, incredibly urgent, and thank you for asking it. This is a time in which foreign languages, and not just Italian, are really in a position to rethink what they're for, what they want to do now and in the future, not just when they hear from the administration, but when they think of young people, the new generation, and what they're going to be doing with their studies. And in Italian, this paradigm shift has been particularly painful because, unlike, for example, French, we didn't go through that phase of Francophone studies, for example, which lasted for a very long time. Post-colonial theory, right, that really became ingrained in both teachers' and students' minds, right, for a very long time. So we went from the national paradigm, very much artificial, as you can imagine, because the canon is really crafted out of a decision, right, and proposed as such, to now dealing with all these issues. Take Amara Lacous, born in Algeria, speaking Arabic and French, deciding to write in Italian when he moves to Italy and becomes eventually an Italian citizen. And now he lives in New York and is thinking about writing in English, as a matter of fact. So, in front of all of this, what kind of Italy do we teach, right? And it has become more and more obvious, Norma, that we need to teach transnational Italy. That is to say, what has been for a very long time marginal to our discourse. So we teach Dante, we teach Petrarca, we teach Boccaccio, and then we teach Amara Lacous, right? They need to coexist, right, in much more structured ways, so that this type of mapping of Italy is actually in Italian 101, so that from the very beginning we understand that we're dealing with a language and a culture that has belonged to many communities and continues to belong to many communities. This requires a lot of curricular rethinking, and I think it's already happening. I'm thinking in particular of a very fascinating project coming out of the UK. It's called Transnational Italy. Charles Burdett is behind it with Loredana Polezzi. And interestingly, for them, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to rethink classes, we need to rethink content, and only that way this transnational Italy will become central to the discourse. This way, you're not going to go to Italy as students of Italian and be surprised by the type of image that your dean was describing. but you're going to understand it fully. You're going to see the indirect post-colonial subjects that we were talking about. You're going to understand all the imbrications, right, of past immigration and present immigration all at once. And thank you for bringing in two things I did not mention. One is in the book, the internal migration. So we are a country that has seen a lot of internal mobility and continues to experience it. And I really liked his reading of Italian unification as an act of colonization. This has been absolutely crucial in recent reading of the formation of the Italian nation. And I think this is pretty reassuring. I'm sorry, it's a bit of pop culture here, but I went to see Fiorella Mannoia's concert in New York, and at some point she actually quoted some of the literature you were referring to, the fact that all of a sudden she realized that Italy's unification needs to be reread, right, as an usurpation and abuse of the South, and she has written a song about that. So the consciousness, right, is growing and taking place and becoming part of moments that are actually incredibly transversal in terms of diffusion of knowledge. So, thank you. Any other questions?
We're opening it up a little bit. I know we're holding you captive, but if you don't mind just allowing a few more questions,
No, absolutely, and please ask questions also of clarification, because I understand that a lot of data is being introduced, and maybe these connections for the first time are not easy to make. So tell me if there's something that you need clarifications about. There's one in the front.
Clarification, why spaces? Preoccupied spaces? Why spaces?
As I mentioned briefly before, instead of looking at immigration or emigration in terms of time, when does it start, when does it end, when does it pick up again, which are important questions in the case of Italian immigration, for example. I think it's by looking at space that the type of empathy we've been talking about can take place. So if you, again, let me use the same example. If you think about a tenement in Little Italy, where people were sharing very cramped spaces in very poor conditions. And then you think about, for example, the shanty towns that are developed along some of the rural areas in Puglia, where Senegalese immigrants are living. These are the spaces that make you think in terms of what is the migrant experience. And at that point, it's not necessarily 1910 in Little Italy or the 1990s in Apulia, but you're thinking about a human condition that needs to be inflected historically. I'm not suggesting in a reductive way that they are the same thing, but there are questions that we can ask and that become pertinent because they have to do with the human condition. Does that help in clarifying? And so the spaces I talk about are houses, right, where migrants live, the spaces where they have travel through oceans and seas, and finally the places where they work. And there are many places where migrants work, but I chose two in particular. Construction sector, because interestingly, immigrants actually build nations very often in anonymous ways, and they actually lose their lives in the process, and this is not recognized. Christ in Concrete by Pietro Di Donato is a very powerful reminder of that story. And the second one is domestic work, and I chose that for two reasons. Number one, because that specific sector in Italy has become larger and larger because of the needs of modern families with women working, but also elderly people, right, who need the services I was referring to earlier. But interestingly, le badanti, as they are, called with a term that I don't necessarily espouse, they are the only ones that are considered to be particularly legitimate. And so whenever there's an amnesty, it's actually for badanti. What does it mean that we allow migrants who are seen as invaders to come into the most intimate places of our private, houses? bathrooms and bedrooms and taking care of the people that are dearest to us. And we basically place their lives into the hands of foreigners that are seen as a problem. So the contradictions there is particularly strident and powerful. And even at the governmental level, then these are the people that actually are given special permits because we need them economically, right? And they become the real infrastructure of the society. I hope that clarified that a little bit.
Yeah, just add something, Teresa. I don't think there is a family in Italy right now that has not had a history of our migration. Every Italian family has had a member or two, or a time, half of them leave. But somehow, this arrival, from the 17 onwards, has brought up all kind of fear, the threats, the invasion, the Italian losing their national identity. But I do think it's the work, the cultural text, and the people that read them right now that are actually bringing back this history. I mean, it's a very interesting study of repression too. It just is so much part of our fabric. And it is, I think, I would even say disappointing the fact that the Italian cultural consciousness has not been able to leverage its own past in order to be a welcoming society. We were the Albanians, right?
Yeah, no,
So,
I missed opportunity.
this is the concept that preoccupies space.
But if I can add, because I wanted to mention this before in your talk as well, here we have a rift, very powerful one, between public history and private history.
Yeah.
Because if every family, I mean, hypothetically, in Italy does have that history, and they do have those memories.
Yeah.
It's not a public discussion. It's not a public consciousness. So there is that, I think, imbalance right there.
Some of the data you have seen are not part of the history books that are used in the schools. So you know now numbers that Italians may not be able to share with you, quite ironically, and instead they should really be absolutely central in their education, because it would be central to their self-perception of Italians, whatever that means, right? But it needs to be much more layered, much more complex, and much more aware of this complexity. And indeed, there's been an amnesia about colonialism and about immigration, and keeping it within the walls of the family has allowed, right, for the rift that Clarissa was referring to, and this needs to be somehow reversed. Some of the things that they're doing with the Transnational History Italy project, for example, is to depict Dante as an exile, right? As somebody who actually did not have a home and had to find one and wrote effectively out of nostalgia, right? For the homeland. What a paradigm shift, right? And how can we teach that vis-a-vis the history of, again, an Algerian who actually comes to Rome? It's possible, and I think it holds many, many opportunities for the future, in part because I think, and I'm sure that the course you're taking is doing this, you're learning about a really beautiful story, the story of Italians in America. It's one of many migrant stories, but it's one made up of so many contradictions, of so many intense moments, of so many issues that are still widely unresolved, right? And why not pairing that along with